Hello and welcome back to another episode of Supercoach Insider. My name is Ben.
And I'm Swiz.
And thank you for joining us. This is a slightly modified Swizzy. We're going to try and wrap up the team-by-team analysis, probably more of a quick-fire pod. We'll do our rookies podcast, I think, once we see the JLT, so we'll round through things a bit better. But, Swiz, thanks for joining us. Before we move on, though, on our socials, SC Insider 100, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Twitch. You can also find us on all your audio platforms like Spotify, SoundCloud, you name it. And search for us on YouTube, Supercoach Insider. Swiz, the Gold Coast Suns, are you optimistic or are you a hard sale?
I feel really sorry for Stewie Dew. That early fixture, I think it's going to sort of put them back a little bit. But in saying that, every year the Suns seem to start the season on fire. So maybe they can cause a couple more upsets again, because every time it didn't matter. I think a couple of years ago they played the Dogs away and still beat them. And they always seem to start the year 3 and 4 and wins out of the first 5 or 6 rounds. So yeah, maybe actually they can show up and beat some of these teams early. But yeah, I'm a bit worried about looking at that early fixture, mate.
Yeah, it is definitely a little bit challenging. I mean, meanwhile, West Coast are $1.38 favourites. I don't know how they're $1.38 favourites. I think the Suns probably roll them, to be honest. Anyway, yeah, West Coast first, Melbourne, Giants, Carlton, Saints, Lions, Collingwood, Swans, and Freo. So, I mean, it's not the easiest start to the year.
And the
Especially
Bulldogs
when you start
after that,
looking
actually,
at,
mate.
yeah, so it's one of those, they could win a few games in there. It depends on how they start, but for me, it kind of makes me a bit more cautious when you look at Witts. We've spoken about Witts. We'll have, Nick Nat-Nui, Max Gawn, Flynn or Bruce, a couple of easier ones there, but then Saints might be a double team. Lions with Oscar, then Grundy. So it's he plays probably 3 of the better rucks straight away at the year. So for me, it's not a good idea to start Witts based on the matchups and coming off an ACL. And that's probably where we're at. With Touk Miller, I like Touk, but with a harder matchup, it's one of those ones where I'm like, can I just fade him a little bit and go somewhere else? So, yeah, it's going to be an interesting one. We'll start off with talk about premiums. First of all, let's talk about Touk Miller. Touk Miller, he's 677K. So he's third most expensive midfielder, which is a lot of quiche to pay. But the upside is that number one, Touk is going to be the main person in the engine room. They lost Greenwood. So Touk, it's really going to be a Touk show as far as he has to be the main go-getter. He also got unrewarded a lot for his tackles last year. So that is probably the big selling point for me when you look at a Steele and a Touk, is that they actually tackled a lot and didn't get rewarded, which should change this year because they are extremely hot on prior. And if you do a little 360 or a little 180, bang, he's going to get rewarded. So I think there could be some upside, Swizz. What do you think?
Yeah, it's a real balancing with Touk because, yeah, as you said, those rule changes should help him because he's with him and Steele are the 2 highest tacklers in the league. You look at his start last year, he started a little slow and then, came home and the house on fire. So does that mean he starts slow or is actually room for improvement? Because, maybe it was just, getting at some of those cobwebs with the Suns and finding that midfield balance. No Greenwood anymore, so there's more reliance on him. Witts now back hitting the ball where they're down to him, where last year they had makeshift rucks for most of the year. So, yeah, there is probably actually upside the more you think about it with Touk. There's not too many players outside of Rowell taking those points off him in the midfield. They don't have a terrible midfield compared to some of the other teams. That's probably their strength. But in saying that, Touk and Rowley are the 2 main boys. The only issue then comes, do teams put time into him? But with Miller, he's such a tackling machine. It's a bit like Jack Steele when they put time in him. He just goes and stands with someone else and just starts tackling the player. So those boys are hard to lock down because they can play lockdown roles while they're being locked down.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I guess the key part as well, from the last 14 rounds, so in the middle stage, 7 rounds at a 130.1 and then another 7 rounds at a 132.3. So he definitely did finish the season extremely strong. And for me, the key part is had 86% of his games were over 100 Supercoach. He had 11 scores over 125 or more. So he's definitely a good VC's kind of option. He, I think, gains a bit of confidence from last year, and he could be a bit of a point of difference because I know a lot of people are like, he might not back it up, or they kind of go, I'll go with McRae or an Oliver people that have done it, once before or, more times than he has. But I think there's definitely some value there. I'm extremely keen. I've had him in and out of my side a little bit more because I think he has to be the one that scores for the Gold Coast. So I definitely can't fault you if you are starting him in draft leagues. So Swizz, would you jump extremely early or would you kind of just go around him a little bit?
I guess it depends on who's there, and I see him going very early in a lot of drafts, and unfortunately in the drafts I've been in, I haven't been that high up the ladder to even consider him. But yeah, it's one of those. It depends on what strategy and how the draft format is. We were talking about before we came on the show, Benny, how you're in a two ruck draft format before the other day. So there you're targeting the rucks early, but if you're just in that sort of standard one ruck, midfield heavy, yeah, I think you can rely on Touk because, though he's had a few injuries over the time, you're going to get at least 17, 18 games out of him. And, for draft leagues, that's all you're going to need. And
That
he's
sounds
going to
good.
score premium scores. So, yeah, there's no reason why not to touch him with one of those early picks.
And let's move on to Matty Rowell, probably the next most important pick for the Gold Coast. Definitely relevant for Supercoach, for any sort of fantasy football you are playing. Also relevant for draft leagues because he does get taken fairly early as well. Matty Rowell is 342,000, extremely cheap based on what he can deliver, but it's his body that has people questioning things. So they're like, oh, Matty Rowell, injury prone, etc. But he wasn't really injury prone during his juniors. He was like, oh, wow, first injury. And he just had a bad little bit of run. His body looks good. He's training. He looks like an absolute beast. He as well has to be a big part of the engine room because with Greenwood gone, it literally has to be the Touk, the Anderson, and the Rowell show with a sprinkling of other players coming through. So Rowell for me is extremely important. And people forget, number one, he's 342K. Worst case scenario, yes, obviously everything could fall apart, but he's highly owned, 25% or more at this point. If he goes off in the next intra-club game, though, I mean the Amy series or whatever, he'll get heavily owned for sure. But even then, he has a high ceiling. So at a worst, outside of injury, I expect him to at least crack off a couple of big ceiling games, at least make 150,000. He'll easily get to 500, 550K. And if you don't like him, if he doesn't look like a keeper, then you could easily go and actually upgrade him at a later stage. So I know he has the first buy, which is kind of the little bit of the iffy mark for me. But Matty Rowell, when we look at how he started a couple years ago, right, 80, 171, 141, 114, he has a ceiling. He can kick goals. He can get forward. He can get contested ball. He can make tackles. He's a good decision maker, right? So for me, it's a no-brainer. I am big on Rowell. And I know some other people aren't, but he is someone that could definitely hurt you. He's probably the only mid-price, as in 300K sort of. I know some other people are ignoring him and going with was it the Western Border gone to Collingwood now? I can't remember his name.
Lipinski.
Lipinski. And Rowell every day of the week for me. Just he's a freak. And the quality of player he was and how hyped up everyone was 2 years ago, if you were part of the 50% or whatever that started Rowell last year, you have to double down this year. The talent doesn't just go away.
Yep.
And
Yep, sure.
Swizz.
Yeah, I've had him in and out. Like, how can you not like Rowley? The guy is the ultimate professional. Just a couple freak injuries obviously let him down. That could have been one of the great first seasons of footy. Anybody who comes out and in your first couple of games scores a 171 and a 141 just shows the potential of this guy. Last year, naturally didn't have the same scoring. What was the final average there? Like a 63. So I think there's some people worried and go, well, maybe Rail scoring isn't as high, but then some of those time on ground percentages weren't as high as you would have expected from Rowley. They bit of a cautious approach as they were working him back in, and the Suns did have more midfielders last year. They still got Swallow, Weller, who will probably be, in that new role. They were still giving game time to Anderson, Greenwood. So there was quite a few guys in there, but as we've said, with Greenwood going, Touk's the number one midfielder, but I think they back Rowell in as that number two guy. And yeah, it's at worst case, even on that game, I think it was against the D's where he played that little bit more game time, he still scored an 84. I think that's kind of the worst case. He probably averages mid 80s, and that at the very worst, and potentially there. It could be 95, 100. So you're looking at that sort of, Hewitt, possibly even Chera scoring for a discount price. So it's if he gets through this practice match with unscathed and looks like he's playing, 70% at least, 80% on anywhere between that time, it kind of becomes a no-brainer. But he's just got to get through this game unscathed and look like he's doing all the right things.
No, I agree. Let's touch on Lockie Weller now. We'll go Lockie Weller, 400,000. So we're starting to get into a little bit of that mid-range sort of bracket, and we'll then probably sprinkle off with a few more drafts, a little bit of relevance here, everyone. So Lockie Weller, 400,000, being taken a little bit higher just based off his last, the practice match. So Lockie Weller was playing, defensive and then even pushing up to the wing a little bit, but he was getting kickouts. So that's a big one, particularly with, Bose that's out for a third of the season. That's kind of what's getting people interested. Do note, though, however, he is a forward mid, I believe. So he won't actually pick up a third position. So you're kind of stuck with that forward mid, but he could, with that role, average you a 90 plus. I don't think that's completely unachievable. Swiz, role dependent.
Yeah, it very much is. That's why once Bose went down, who unfortunately had in a couple of keeper leagues, I was really big on Will Powell instead. But it looks like, Weller, when he first got to the club, was playing some of that role, and that's why they kind of targeted him at the first place. They gave up a massive high draft pick. I think it was Brayshaw's pick when they got him across from Freo. So he's has some qualities about him. I'm just worried about that sort of scoring. Yeah, maybe in a new role, but then he's played midfield before and averaged a top of 88. So he doesn't have the kind of scoring that some of the other players. Yes, he's priced at that 73 mark, but a guy who the last few years hasn't played 22 games, hasn't shown the potential to score big. Even in drafts, I'm not that, bullish on him. If he's even as having that forward status, I'm like, well, what's his best here, Benny? What, 80, 85? And that's still
He
even
could
with
he
that
could
role.
push 90, but again, I wouldn't be picking him at that high price. Some people are jumping early, and again, we saw this yesterday. I did a YouTube video with YouTubers, the draft league. Butters went pick 12. Heaney went like third round or something rather. People just all these hype players in draft leagues. Sometimes, and it gets quite boring because sometimes when everyone's going all the hype and it's all interesting and they're picking all these players, Lockie Weller jumping early. Sometimes it sounds boring, but you're best off looking at the next best available and loading up. And that's what happens in draft league. Sometimes you go in there and I was eyeing off Butters, but I'm like, pick 12. I was like, fuck, have him. You know what I mean? Like if he averages 115, then pretty much you're going to get what you paid for him. So it's an interesting one for me. Weller in the same sort of boat. I'd pick him up at an 80 odd, 73. He averaged last year, I think 80. Yes, I'm not going to jump high on that. You want some fat on the bone. You want profits. And if you're paying what you expect to get from them, all you're ever going to do is either get your money back or lose if they don't meet your expectations. So it's a funny one for me. I'm going to tie him in with here. N.Anderson, 455K, not standard relevant, I don't believe, but draft leagues. Middle 7 rounds, he averaged, 90.3. So first 7 averaged 90.3. Last 6 averaged 93.2. Had a lull in the middle, which is probably to be expected, I guess. Fairly new player. Picking up at an 83 average when you're looking at drafting, I don't see why he couldn't go 90 plus this year. He did it at the start of the year, did it at the end of the year, and I think he could probably string it together. And I think he's now more important to Gold Coast than previously as well. I have nothing but love for Anderson in a draft league or a deep draft league. I think he goes 90 plus easily. Swiz.
Yeah, and once again, I've got him in a couple of keeper leagues. It's just a no-brainer. His best mate, Matty Rowell, there back next to him. Played the 20 games last year, looked really good. That average of 83, it's just going to improve. He's got all the skills. He was a number 2 draft pick for a reason. And yeah, a lot of people aren't touching. I see him as the slider in a lot of drafts too. So yeah, more than happy if you can sort of that M5 range, absolutely perfect in that. Because yeah, if he's still there at that sort of, well, what did we say? Average last year, 83. He has been there around that 85 mark with some drafts I've seen. So you're actually getting what he paid, what he's worth last year. but with the potential to, score those 90s. And yeah, I'm more than happy to target him that little bit earlier because I think he's such a good player. And with Greenwood going, we know those extra minutes now.
Yeah, no, I agree. Okay, so let's round out a couple of little bit more draft relevance here for everyone. Okay, so a couple here. Here's an eye on now. It's if you're playing in a real deep draft league. Jeremy Sharp, man, he passed the aesthetic test. He actually put on some muscle, put on some size. He was already extremely fit. Now he was one that they actually traded Geelong for because they still rated him as a first round pick, and he went like pick 27 because he was a bit skinnier but super fit. He's put on some size. He actually outran a couple of people down the wing. He's doing so much stuff there where in a deep draft league, I actually think he could be one to break out a little bit. And there's a lot of those mid-range Gold Coast players. If they start winning more games, there's definitely some of that pie and some of that development that could be had between Jeremy Sharp, Isaac Rankine as well, banged out a couple of hundreds in his first year and looked really dynamic. Lost it last year, but apparently he looks back to being quite impressive. So even in a real draft, like no one's going to pick him up. And Isaac Rankine, when you have a 16 team, he's definitely someone that I could pick up for some upside if you're looking, quite deep. And that's probably about it. Like Witts, I'd probably leave in a draft league. Yeah, if you get desperate, you could probably pick him up quite late in a draft league. And that's kind of about it. Like as far as when you look at draft relevancy, your Swallows and your Ellises, you're kind of going to get what you expect. Will Powell is one I'm probably half decent on. Lukosius playing forward, I'm probably avoiding Lukosius. He might average 80 again, but man, like you look at when King went down, so now you probably have your Levi Casbolts, a few of your other players sort of doing the forward role. It's one of those things where Lukosius, I'm like, as a forward, I'm not as keen. Swiz, any other smokies you got?
Yeah, you know what's interesting about Rankin? So I'm in a draft league with 30. We have 30 players, and 20 we get to keep 20 of them. And Rankin was still there as a draftable player. I think even those mid sort of about 25 and that because he's just not being touched. Probably haven't seen the best of him yet, so could be a little smoky there in a lot of leagues where you could be your last pickup and you're like, oh well, Rankin's there, I may as well throw him on because there's a lot more love for the Darcy McPhersons or even Alex Sexton I've seen go because they've sort of done it before and had their moments where, yeah, I think a few people just kind of just forget about some of those players, and I think Sharp's a really good call there, mate.
They got talent coming out of their
got a lot
ears
of,
too.
and that's their biggest probably issue is like how do you fit all this talent in week to week, and at some point if they can keep them together they're going to be fantastic. Mac Andrew, if you're in a keeper league, worthy to pick up late and chuck on your bench. What's Witts now, 31, something like that, and got those injury concerns. They picked him
maybe,
up as the next ruckman, so yeah, if you're in a deep keeper, chuck him on there. But outside of that, you're right about Lukosius. I wouldn't be touching him playing key forward. There's no upside there. Brandon Ellis has been actually left in a lot of drafts late. A lot of people aren't touching him, but he has the potential off half back to pump
get
out those
DPP
90s
even.
and get DPP. So yeah, he's not a bad one if you're looking at and he's still there deep in your draft. Yeah, absolutely, go grab Brandon Ellis. But yeah, it's a hard one for some of those other ones because they can chop and change a little bit. Like they've brought in Chol as well. They've actually it's the
Chol
Richmond
kicked a
seconds.
few.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Joel, Ellis, Markov. It's all these boys that remember watching it down at Punt Road. But so it's going to be hard to sort of work out what their best 22 is. I think we probably know their best 16, but the next 6 guys, and that makes it a little bit hard for draft. So if you're in a draft league where you've only got 4 on the bench, maybe avoid some of these guys. If you're in a draft league where there's sort of 8 on the bench, you probably could handcuff a couple of them because you can every week there might be one of them playing, one of them won't be. So yeah, the Suns, I think it's all dependent in draft on how the structure again.
Yeah, no, I agree. And one that I am also keeping an eye on is, again, they have talent. So you look at Isaac Rankin, I picked him up in a keeper league because people dropped him. He had a bad year and they dropped him. I'm like, man, he was picked, 2? He looks so
3.
talented. And,
Yeah.
and he can go through the midfield. So the other one, Sam Flanders as well. Apparently he's working really hard, impressed in the practice match and is working hard on transition. So I think even just for the future, ones to watch for because I think Flanders has a lot to give as well. Atkins as well. So I'm going to go a couple of draft standard relevance just to touch on briefly. Number one, Rory Atkins, 248K, could end up going on the wing. didn't really feature much last year. Didn't really score very well either. I think 8 games at a shit average. So I don't know if he's actually relevant at all. I mean, they signed him up for so long. And the ones that we're watching in the preseason, probably looking at, I think it's your mate Alex Davies at 202,000 midfielder, played 1 game at the end of last year and looks to have played well in the trial game. So he's one to watch. The next one, Elijah Hollins, 123K, mid forward, highly owned. Yeah, I think he played VFL, so I'm not sure if that's trying to get some exposure into his body or something, but he was on the wing, had 3 shots on goal. Keen to see if he plays in the Amy preseason game. And the other one is also, I think, Ned Moyle was impressive against Lyset. He's a ruck, 123K ruck. Now, if Witts goes down and gets injured again, he looks like he would actually be the one to take over in that ruck department. And he apparently impressed up against Lyset before he tweaked an ankle, and could be an option if Witts doesn't get up or gets injured.
Yeah, I'll throw in Joel Jeffrey as well, 127 forward, just as another option. If especially Day with his injury history, their forward line could end up looking like the coaches Joel, Jeffrey, and Chol at some point throughout the season.
Casbolt.
Casbolt, well, we know his body as well. So it wouldn't surprise me if he gets a run at some point. So the scoring potential is probably not huge there, but at the same time, with the right draw, some of those softer games later on could come in and kick a couple goals and score 40, 50 points at his price.
The forward line's not that dire, though. I mean, it's not great. It's kind of like a 2-bit forward line, but, Casbolt, Chol, Corbett, do you know what I mean? So and then you put in, when you sort of try and sprinkle in a little bit of Lukosius, etc. It's not the best forward line, but I've seen, worse.
Oh, I don't know if it's a bit, mate. I said the Suns. I
don't
mind their back line. I don't mind their midfield. I think their midfield's quite good, but
it's a
even like Sexton, McPherson have shown it before, but it doesn't fill me with a lot of confidence. I think up there where the ball hits the ground and those games where 60 points can win you a match, they'll be in some games there. But on the faster decks down here, like at Marvel or over in Perth and that, I think they're going to really struggle to score.
I think their midfielders have to kick a lot of goals, and I think Rankine's probably more important to them than he realises.
Mm-hmm.
He needs to kick 40 plus this year, Rankine, I think, as a small.
Not going to happen. I can't see it happening.
Yeah, we'll see. Darcy McPherson's still kicking around. Anyway, that wraps us up for Gold Coast. Nice and simple, nice and short. Probably sums up the Gold Coast quite well, actually. But as for the rookies, we'll keep an eye on that. Elijah Hollins, will touch on that after we see the Amy series, and we'll go on to rookies in a bit more depth, because at the moment I think rookies are definitely up in the air and we're not sure. We need a little bit more data, so we'll watch this weekend coming up intently and go from there. All right, thank you, Swiz. We will move on now to the GWS, also known as the Carlton affiliate, handing all their players over, and we'll catch you next time, guys.
See ya.
Bye.